graphing the cosine function, and exactly the same as sine, your cosine functions are going to be in the form y equals a cosine b theta. To graph one cycle, we are going to need to know what the a is. Remember, a is going to be your amplitude. And then we're going to need to know what the period is. And the period is the length of one cycle. And to find it, you take 2 pi and divide it by your b value. So common mistake is just to take that b value and call that your period. That is not going to work because your period is the length of one cycle. Your b is the number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi. So we have to do a little bit of work to find out what that period is. But I start by finding my a and my period of each of these. So my a is going to be 1 since there's no number there. Period is going to be 2 pi over 2, which ends up just being pi. So 2 pi over 2, which is just pi. So now that helps me to start to construct my graph. So I'm going to go from 1 to -1. And one cycle is going to bring me to pi. If it did want me to do 2 cycles, which we'll get to here eventually, 2 cycles, I would just extend this out to 2 pi, and then I could graph 2 of those cycles. But I'm just doing 1. Then I find the halfway point, and that's going to be pi over 2. And half of pi over 2 is going to be pi over 4. So now when I'm starting to make my intervals, I'm counting by pi over 4, or you could think of it as like 1/4. So this is pi over 4, 2 pi over 4. This one's going to be 3 pi over 4. Or if you want to count by fractions, just don't even think about the pi. This is going to be 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. Now in blue, I'll graph out my coordinates. So difference is now cosine always starts at the maximum, goes through 0, heads down to the minimum, goes back through 0, and we finish at the maximum again. So you'll notice that all these graphs are going to look very similar. What I'm looking for is how are your intervals set up? So do you have the correct period? Do you have the correct intervals within your period to set this up? On to number 2. Number 2, my a value, my amplitude, I should say, is going to be 1. But I do have a negative, so that means that this one is going to be a flip over the x. So all our functions that we've talked about throughout the year, anytime we have a negative out in front, that means we're going to have a flip over the x. And then lastly, my period is going to be 2 pi over 3. So we go to our graph, we're going to make our amplitudes -1 to 1, and then I'm going to signify my period of one cycle is 2 pi over 3. Now we get into thirds. Well, this is like 2/3. You can think of like baking 2/3 of a cup. If you wanted to cut 2/3 of a cup in half, that's going to be 1/3 because 1/3 plus 1/3 is 2/3. So pi over 3 is going to be my middle point. And then half of 1/3 is 1/6. I'm just doubling that denominator. So pi over 6. So this means I'm counting by pi over 6's. Pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6. Well, 3 over 6, aka, is 1/2. So that's going to be pi over 2. And then 2 pi over 3 would be my last interval. And we've got to flip over the x. So now instead of starting at the maximum, we are starting at the minimum. So sine and cosine can be reflected over the x. With sine, you always start at 0, but sine, you would start going down first. With cosine, we're going to start at the minimum and finish at the minimum. So there's going to be our cosine graph, like so. So it's just flipped over the x. It's just the U shape now flipped the other direction. And heading into problem C, our amplitude again is 1. So nothing really exciting there. Our period is going to be 2 pi over pi over 2. So here we get that complex fraction. This fraction bar, the main fraction bar right here, is a division. So this is really going to be 2 pi times 2 over pi. So we're going to multiply by that reciprocal. Well, the pi's are going to reduce out. We have 1 in the numerator, 1 in the denominator. 2 times 2 gives me 4. So that tells me my period is 4. So there's 4, and this makes it easy. This is going to be half of 4, which is 2. Half of 1, which is 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. Amplitude maximum is 1. Minimum -1. It's not flipped, so we start at the maximum. Go down through 0, minimum, 0, maximum. There would be our cosine graph. So your cosine, obviously, we've talked about this quite a bit. It's going to look the same. Just checking what are those intervals. Are you getting those correct intervals? Finding that period, 2 pi over b, and then working to create your theta axis and then create your y axis.